Hello and welcome back to the Football Heritage Podcast. I'm your host, Rory Bryce, and today I'm joined once again by Brock Mildon.
Hello, it's good to be here.
Really good to have you back on, Brock. We were just talking off-air about how long it's been since you've last been on the show. It's an absolute pleasure to have you back on. Last spoke with you about 2 years ago now on the Danes Cup and the soccer history of Utah. But of course, since then, you've contributed articles to us, and we've continued to be in touch discussing all things football kits and all the goings on in world football. Brock is otherwise known as Brock's Kit Closet. He's an avid kit collector and has kits from all over the world. But he's also a huge fan and is heavily involved with soccer in Utah. And as a researcher in the history of soccer in Utah and its development. So, Brock, why don't you quickly tell some of our newer listeners a little bit more about yourself?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks again for having me on. It's good to be back. Yeah, my name is Brock. I'm from Utah, born and raised. I did live in Germany and Switzerland for about 2 years. And so, I know kind of the soccer landscape there in Europe as well. Visited multiple times. But yeah, I'm just trying to do my best to kind of showcase to the world what Utah has to offer in terms of soccer, and that we do, in fact, have a rich history of soccer here in the States and in Utah. Like Rory said, I'm a big kit collector. I enjoy that, and I enjoy spending time ground hopping, going to non-league games, lower league games here in Utah.
Yes, I mean, the very first time you came on here, you really opened my eyes to how much the development of soccer in Utah and the history of it is quite reflective of the development of soccer in the rest of the USA. Of course, a lot of people would probably look to the East Coast as being the soccer hotbed of the US. Not necessarily true, though, as we found out from some of the stories that we've told. You had hotbeds in Utah, you had hotbeds out west, down south in Texas, around the Chicago coal mines and the rest of the coal mines in Illinois. So soccer really kind of sprang up anywhere, and migration obviously had a big part to play in that. It's going to feature in the story that we're telling today. This is probably one of the most interesting stories that I think we've had on the podcast so far. It's a story which involves numerous different individuals across continents and really revolves around this connection between soccer in Utah and the Third Reich in Nazi Germany. And it centres really on two characters, Helmuth Hübener and Arthur Zander, who was head of a congregation in Utah of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or Mormons as they're more commonly known. To give a quick background on Helmuth Hübener, he was, and it's probably most well known as being the youngest person to be executed for being part of the anti-Nazi resistance in Germany. He was executed at just 17 years old. He grew up and was a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in Germany. I think there was a statistic that said something like out of his congregation in Hamburg with his friend, there were only really 6 or 7 people who were pro-Nazi out of a congregation of hundreds, if not thousands of people, which is incredible. They were really open, they really opposed what the Nazis were doing, and through this opposition, Helmuth became a sort of resistance writer. He would listen to the BBC radio, which in the time in Germany was illegal, it was considered treason, and he would use that to then write anti-Nazi pamphlets for the resistance and distribute them around Hamburg. And it was through those activities that he was caught and then summarily executed by the regime. Now, there's a lot at play here because that's kind of where Arthur Zander steps in. So if you want to kick us off then, Brock, what does this event that happens thousands of miles away across the Atlantic Ocean have to do with soccer history in Utah?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, you gave a little bit of background on Helmuth Hübener. Like you said, he was the youngest person executed by the Nazis at the age of 17. He was tried as an adult and therefore executed for his anti-Nazi, you would say, propaganda or writings. He distributed hundreds, if not thousands, of leaflets throughout the city of Hamburg, where he was from, due to the truth that he found from, as you said, the BBC radio. His older brother, his half-brother, was in the German army, and he was serving in France, and that's where he was able to purchase the radio and bring it back, and he gifted it to Helmut. But then the story of Arthur Zander is very much intertwined with Helmut. So in Hamburg, where he lived, there was a congregation of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And there were 3, maybe 4 different congregations of the church in the city of Hamburg itself. But this particular congregation, it was called the Sankt Georg, St. George congregation or branch, happened to be the largest in all of West Germany. There was about 413 active members, to which Arthur Zander was the branch president, or you would say bishop, the leader of the branch.
I'm with you, yeah.
So he was the branch president, or otherwise known as the bishop, the leader of the branch, and he was an active party member of the Nazi Party. He himself was a recent convert, we would say, to the church. He had joined the church just a few years earlier himself. So he didn't grow up necessarily in the church. He had relatives, cousins who were members of the church, and they were basically the ones that introduced him to the church. He grew up playing soccer. He was a big soccer fan, football fan. He would play football with his cousins, and that's kind of how he got introduced to the church. He was employed at Henkel, which is a big company in Germany dealing with chemicals and hygiene products, things like that. They actually currently are the jersey sponsor of Dusseldorf. Henkel is headquartered in Dusseldorf, but they had an office in Hamburg. And during World War II, they were very much a part of the Nazi Party. The higher ups of the Henkel company were all members of the party. And so I assume that was a big reason for Arthur Zander to join, just to as a way of showing allegiance to his company, but also the party which they supported, so that he could, I assume, progress in his career. So he did join the Nazi Party. There's differing accounts and eyewitness stories of maybe how well involved he was, how much he truly believed in the Nazi Party. Some say he was, some say he wasn't, so it's hard to say. But he was officially a member of the Nazi Party, yes.
Yeah, with Helmuth's congregation in Hamburg, they were obviously very sympathetic to the oppression and the genocide and the Holocaust which was taking place upon Jewish people. And a lot of this centred around the Kristallnacht, which is the November pogroms which took place in 1938, also known as Night of the Broken Glass. And it was after that event that these congregations in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints decided that, you know, that this was something that they were opposed to. This is something that they were against. But would I be right in saying that over in America, it was a little bit different, and the congregations and the church itself took on a little bit more of an indifferent stance? Would that be correct in saying? Because I was doing a little bit of research on it, and it wasn't entirely clear.
Yes, definitely. So it's hard to speak on 70, 80 years ago when clearly I wasn't around, and so I'm doing the best that I can with my research. But I will say, present time, the church is politically neutral. So there have been higher up members of the church who have been part of specific parties, but the church itself remains politically neutral. Now, at the time, yes, I would say it was very difficult being thousands of miles away back in the 30s and 40s. Communication definitely was not what it is today. I think, as I've learned and researched, it was kind of more of lay low, be careful, for yourselves. Don't do anything crazy. Don't do anything extremist. Just kind of try and protect yourself, protect your fellow members of the ward, your friends, your neighbors.
Yeah. And Arthur Zander kind of took this one step further, and he saw the actions of Helmuth Hübener. And again, I think it's interesting, and obviously we have the benefit of hindsight. We have the benefit of being able to apply things to these, but we also have the benefit of never having lived under a fascist regime before. Again, just from the research that we've both done, it seemed like Arthur Zander would tell people to avoid getting involved with Helmuth Hübener and his activities because it would potentially bring harm or cause trouble for other members of the church.
Definitely. I think it was definitely a difficult time. It was a hard line to walk. I think there are a lot of people here, especially in Utah, who kind of praise Helmut and kind of make him a hero for the things he did, for being actively outspoken about the Nazis, trying to share the truth of what actually happened with others around. Whereas I think a lot of people still to this day in Germany have a sour taste, a hard taste for him, where they say, you know, that stupid little boy, look what he did. He knew what he was doing. He could have put all of us in danger by doing what he did. And so it's a difficult, you know, situation. There's definitely nuance to it. Arthur Zander, so he did at one of the meetings, he put a sign on the door that said no Jews allowed.
Mm.
Um, he always said years after, when asked about it, he said that that came from his superiors, his leadership of the church, that said, you know, we need to do this to protect the members of the church. Whereas other people said, no, I think that was kind of miscommunicated and he kind of did that on his own. It was hard to say. I think he did what he could to help his members of the church to be safe. When he found out about Helmuth Hübner, which he swore he had no idea about, when he found out what had happened, he wrote on Helmut's membership record, he wrote excommunicated. I think he did that to help save his members of the church. There are reports that pretty much every Sunday when they would meet and worship, there were members of the Gestapo that would visit. Sometimes they would come announced and presented as Gestapo. Other times they came secretly. And so I think he really just tried to do what he could to help his branch and save his branch and keep the Nazis, you know, kind of away from them if possible.
Away from them, I understand. And again, you know, we have the benefit of, you know, the things that we're talking about. Well, it might be easy to judge people for the decisions that they make. You know, I'm always one to say, especially on this show, that there is always a decision to be made. But I think a lot of people can be quite quick to judge those decisions when they don't understand the reality of what people were living under, especially when religious persecution was stretching to so many people, including the Jewish population at the time. So a lot of people did choose to self-preserve, whether that was themselves or their congregations, whereas other people like Helmut chose to resist and join active parts of the resistance. It was just different ways that people chose to survive what was, well, the most oppressive, brutal, and murderous regime in history. In the same ways, you know, like you mentioned there was a bit of conjecture whether or not Arthur Zander received these from higher ups within his congregation or the church, but it's in the same way that the Catholic Church in Ireland was very pro its members going to fight for the nationalist Franquists in Spain. Do you know what I mean? The Catholic Church, and again in Ireland, because of the anti-British sentiment, were quite happy for people and actually encouraged people to go off and fight for the Nazis. You know, it's very, very well written, and religion within World War II plays such a strange and fluid role. But when we also look at the individuals, you know, there are so many nuances to their actions and what they actually done that it's, you know, it's always interesting to speak about, I think, when we have the benefit of hindsight almost 100 years later.
Yes, definitely. I think another part was a lot of people today, I think, they have a hard time understanding the Nazi party. I mean, early on, it was Hitler giving hope to people who had been downtrodden after the First World War. They were poor, they had nothing. And this charismatic leader came in and tried to raise the hopes of people. You know, he said, we're going to help unemployment rates, we're going to have these national programs to help people find jobs and to help our economy. You know, the Autobahn was one example, and the Volkswagen, the car. You know, we want everyone to have a vehicle, and we want people to be happy again. That's why a lot of people, I think, started joining the Nazi Party. I have a stat here that says the average rate of in Germany of people joining the party was only 10%. So still, that's very, very low.
Mm,
Um, the LDS Church, they joined the Nazi Party at a rate of 2.4%.
mm. So well below the average.
And so I think that's another reason why Arthur Zander did what he did. There was an article I found and backed up by a first time source that said once Helmuth Hübener was taken in for questioning and interrogation, somebody else from the church was asked and was also interrogated. And the Gestapo said, why aren't you Mormons, basically falling in line? Why aren't you joining the party? After the Jews, you guys are next. And I think that was a direct correlation to the percentage of the members of the church not joining the party in whole. So I think that was another reason why Arthur Zander did what he did to try and save the members of the branch that he had stewardship over.
Yeah. And just quickly as well, just because this is something that I don't know myself, was the church eventually outlawed in Nazi Germany?
I'm That's a great question. I don't know a definitive answer on that. I know that many congregations had to, like I said earlier, lay low. They had to meet in people's, houses, apartments. They had to modify their worship services, like in terms of like their talks of what they could talk about, what they could sing about. They couldn't really sing about this idea of Zion or people coming together, having their own community, their own unity. Where the Nazis wanted it to be all about being a part of the Nazis and things like that. So I don't know if it was officially shut down. I know that after the war, with so much mass destruction and even of the German population, a lot of branches were closed or combined with other congregations just because so many people had been lost due to the war. So,
Yeah, like you mentioned, people were pushed underground in a lot of senses, forced to change how they worship, and had to go into hiding almost, very reflective of how other religions and other minority peoples were treated during World War II. But of course, like we mentioned earlier, migration plays a huge part in this story, as it does through the history of soccer football in Utah. And in this case, a lot of members of the LDS Church decided to move to Utah, obviously with Salt Lake City being the I guess the spiritual or central home of the LDS Church. A lot of people from Germany and elsewhere in Europe migrated, especially members of the church, migrated to Utah. And this is where our football story really kicks in, because Arthur Zander founded one of the most prominent teams within Utah. And this whole thread of football and migration kind of comes together here.
yes, exactly. So he actually founded the team called Alemania. As you mentioned, after the war, hundreds, if not thousands, of members of the church emigrated to Utah for safety, for promise of a better life, for being united and people of their same beliefs and religion. So there were many people who, yeah, moved to Utah for this. As I said earlier, he was a big football fan growing up. He would always play. He was a big supporter and fan of HSV, Hamburg, the big club there. He would attend matches there. And so when he immigrated to Utah with his family, he found soccer very much grassroots, very much not popular. And so he did what he could to try and grow the game here in Utah. Um, as you said, he founded a club, Alemania, and they were very successful. He was the president of that club for many years. They ended up winning 7 state championships. They won 9 straight Danes Cup, which is the longest played tournament in Utah still to this day. Since then, nobody else has won as many titles as they had won. They also won 2 Intermountain Regional Championships, just tournaments here in the Mountain West. They represented Utah in other regional tournaments, and since he left the club, they ended up winning 4 more Danes Cups. So they've won a total of 13, which has never been replicated.
Crazy numbers.
Yeah, they were a very, very successful club. Later on, he founded another club called SC Berlin, and they won the Danes Cup in 1982. and they were current and played up until just a couple years ago, where they disbanded, and then most of their players went to a different club. But he did a lot here in the state of Utah.
Mm. I guess just for a wee bit of context as well for our listeners, grassroots soccer in Utah is and always has been historically very, very popular. And it's really manifested itself through this tournament called the Danes Cup, which is kind of like sort of like the national trophy for any European country, sort of the equivalent of the Scottish Cup in Scotland, although it's contested largely by amateur and semi-professional and grassroots football clubs. Obviously, you have Real Salt Lake, who are the MLS representative of Utah, but there's such a great grassroots scene within Utah. So when Arthur Zander moved over to Utah and started setting these clubs up, did it become a sort of hub and meeting place for other people who had migrated or been displaced during or after World War II? You know, because you hear these stories of all these migrant clubs, and you look to New York as an example, where you have like teams with Celtic in their name, or Harp, or Croatian, or Pan Cyprians, and it really gives you, well, I mean, it does tell you who these clubs were meant to represent. It was meant to represent the different diasporas that lived there. I'm guessing there was something that was quite similar happening in Utah and in and around Salt Lake City at this time.
Yes, definitely. So there was a club called Vikings, and they to this day are the longest playing team in Utah. They were founded in the 20s. They were founded by people from Scandinavia, Norway mostly. There were these couple teams from Germany, Alemania, Berlin, and Germania. There was a Greek team that was quite successful and won the Danes Cup. And then later on, like in the 80s, 90s, there started popping up, Hispanic teams from Mexico, Guatemala, South America, places like that. Utah has always kind of been a melting pot just due to the religious aspects. A lot of people immigrate here because of those religious beliefs, and they bring soccer with them from where they came, and they play here.
So obviously, Arthur Zander continues, founds another football club, and continues this rich vein of success that he's brought with him. Because, like you mentioned, he's a huge soccer fan himself, and has obviously brought this love of the game with him from Germany to Utah. So what happens once he founds his second club? Obviously, they have success themselves. Did he ever play in any of the teams, or was he more manager or a kind of benefactor and steward of these clubs as opposed to any kind of important player? What does he go on to do once he's founded his second club?
Yeah, I don't believe he ever really played for them. He was a little bit older in his life at that point, and so he owned the clubs. He was president of these clubs. He coached a little bit. He also was the one who started soccer in high school. Before that, it wasn't sanctioned. It wasn't official. He was the one that sanctioned high school soccer. And early on, it was very small. There was just a handful of high schools that started, but of course, with time, it grew. So he was the first high school soccer coach of South High School, which was in Salt Lake City. It's no longer there today, but in the early years of Salt Lake, like in the 50s when he immigrated, there was a South High School, a West High School, a East High School, and a North High School. And so they competed with a couple other high schools, Highland High and Olympus High. Like I said, he was the first coach of South High School. In 1956, he was actually awarded a silver pin from the German Football Federation for his work in the States with youth and soccer. He also started and owned a soccer equipment store out of the basement of his house, and he did that for decades just because in those early years it was hard here in Utah to get football boots, football shirts, things like that. And so he would have equipment shipped over from Germany, mostly where he was from, and he would sell things out of his house. He also started a nonprofit organization where he would give this equipment to underprivileged youth and adults who needed equipment but couldn't really afford it. Because of this and the things he did for soccer, he's known as the father of Utah soccer. He was inducted into the Utah Soccer Hall of Fame a few years ago. He's done a lot. He helped start soccer at the University of Utah, the big university funded by the state in Salt Lake, and by the other big university in Utah, BYU, Brigham Young University, which is owned and operated by the church. And he started soccer there as well. So he really was the father of Utah soccer. He helped grow the game.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like you've really brought not just organisation to soccer in Utah. Like we said, but by that point, it was really the Danes Cup and other different sort of localised and regional trophies and competitions. So it sounds like he not only brought organisation, but he also brought an infrastructure that soccer in Utah could use into the future, such as school soccer, such as university soccer, something that has actually had a very tangible, lasting legacy.
Yes, definitely. You will find in most states, if not all states in the US, they have a state level league. So here it's the Utah Adult Soccer Association. And then above that are different national leagues like the UPSL or NPSL. And so the soccer pyramid here is, a lot of people will say, difficult to understand. There's only three specified levels, MLS, USL Championship, USL League One, and then after that it's kind of murky, but each state has their own league. Yeah, they compete in different regions around the US for different tournaments and things like that. And then, of course, yeah, there's high school soccer, there's youth club soccer, things like that. So,
yeah, it's incredible. And I think it's this story in particular is one of these things. It's like, you trace the thread of history back to how all these different things within the orbit of this person, Arthur Zander, and Helmuth Hübener, end up coming into play here because, like we said at the beginning here, the way that we were kind of talking about this story before we decided to record it was the links between soccer history of Utah and Nazi Germany. And it's just amazing how these threads of history can manifest themselves through things like migration, through things like religion, and through things like resistance. Football's full of stories. A lot of the time, one of the least interesting things about football is a match that takes place. Do you know what I mean? Because through football and through the stories you find in it, the people are more interesting and the things that revolve around it are more interesting. And to me, this is just one of those many stories.
definitely, football has a way of bringing people together like a few things can, I think. It's a lot of history, a lot of heritage. And yeah, like we said, this is kind of a crazy link between Hitler and Utah soccer, Hitler and the LDS Church in terms of soccer. And Arthur Zander did a lot to save his congregation, I think, in Hamburg, and then do a lot to grow the game here in Utah. The love that he had as a child playing and immigrating here, and then sharing that with others.
That's a really good point. I mean, just on Arthur Zander as well, obviously, he eventually passes away, but he's left, obviously, this incredible legacy behind him in terms of the soccer in Utah. I mean, a couple of things, because obviously, I suppose this is more when we think about how we memorialise the figures that are so prominent within the history of football, wherever we are. A lot of the times it is problematic, and we mentioned that earlier on, that there's a lot of things going on with this story. How is his story remembered?
I think the general public who maybe know the story of Helmuth Hübener remember Arthur Zander for that. He was the bishop of his congregation who, I will say, wrongfully excommunicated him. It wasn't official. I will say, just going off on a tangent here, that the excommunication was invalid. That needed to be done by higher leadership. And so the highest leadership of the church came out after the war and said, we reverse the decision of excommunication, which is interesting. They didn't say we reverse the excommunication. They said we reverse the decision of excommunication. So he, in fact, never was actually excommunicated. But I think a lot of people who know Helmuth Hübener's story look at that, and they look at the leader of the congregation being a Nazi party member and have a sour taste in their mouth. But like I said, I believe that it's nuance, it's difficulty, it's hard to, we have hindsight now. I would say very few people, just the general population, don't know anything about his Utah soccer history. I would say it's only people who are involved in Utah soccer and research Utah soccer that know about his work here. It is still, I would say, very much grassroots level here. I mean, yes, we do have a pro MLS team and college teams and things like that, but it's definitely not the most popular sport here. So I think very few know about his soccer story, and so that's another reason why I wanted to come on the podcast. That's why I enjoy chatting with you and sharing Utah soccer history with people. I want to shout this from the rooftops that we do have soccer history here, and I want people to know that.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely spot on. I think it's great that he's been remembered in the Utah Soccer Hall of Fame. I think that's really important. I think it's fascinating that you guys have your own state Hall of Fame. As it is, and again, this is my European perception coming in. Utah not exactly known for its soccer, as you've said. A lot of other sports come before it, but I think it's great that he is memorialised in the Utah Soccer Hall of Fame as well. But I guess just tangibly, and it gives us an idea of what it was he actually done, because you're not just talking about setting up a couple of like clubs that people can play in school. I mean, you're really talking about setting up the foundation from where soccer can grow in a place, and surely that is Arthur Zander's legacy.
Definitely. I mean, without him, yeah, sure, maybe someone would have come along afterwards and done the same, but he was here and he did what he did. He set up the infrastructure. He set up clubs. He set up high school soccer. He set up university soccer. He did a lot. So definitely the infrastructure, and like we mentioned, yeah, he was in charge of clubs and presidents of clubs, but he really did help lay the foundation and help what soccer here in Utah is today. So,
and I guess just a last point on the clubs that he founded. Obviously, you mentioned that at least one of them folded a few years ago, which is a real shame, because they are part of this thread of history that I mentioned earlier. We can tie that back to Arthur Zander and the story. What about the other club? Because, one just being able to fold like that, and I guess this is probably a bit of a European thing as well, is that having such historic clubs fold is a huge travesty, a massive tragedy, because so much history is being lost. But this is a thing, because at grassroots level, football clubs can fold so quickly and easily, and for a number of reasons. What have his clubs done? I guess in the modern day, what is their legacy and identity, and how is it they represent themselves whenever they play? Is it just Danes Cup that they actually play? And actually, are there any plans for the club that folded to reform at any point?
Yeah, it's definitely hard with soccer here being so grassroots and these leagues. So the state league is very much grassroots. It's maybe comparable to Sunday league over there, or even less so. People get together, hey, let's start a club, let's play a season in this league, and then after that they're gone and they move on to other teams and other leagues. So it's very fluid. Teams come and go all the time. I believe both of these clubs that he founded have folded. They no longer exist. Like I said, the players move on to other teams. It's very much a recreational league, where they play for fun. They're not going to go pro. They're not going to have a career in soccer, most of them. And so they just kind of do it on the weekend is fun, but they all work full time. And like I said, clubs come and go. I will say the one team that remains, Viking, it's very unusual that they've stayed around this long, because other historic clubs have folded and they go away, which is sad. But that is just the reality of it. So I believe both of the clubs have since folded, but they still have a lasting impact. They still play the Danes Cup, like I said, and Viking are doing a lot to tie the record that Alemannia had. They're working on it. They're still around. They're trying to still win. So we'll see if that ever happens. But yeah, I think both of the clubs have since folded, but his legacy remains even still.
And I think, out with his club legacy, it's the wider impact that he's actually had here that I think we're trying to make sure that people know how important it actually was, because being able to set up something like that doesn't happen overnight. Something that's very, very difficult to do, and in a place where soccer isn't the the primary sport is something that can be very challenging, and you can be met with an awful lot of opposition for. But like we said, this is the legacy that Arthur Zander has left behind. It's an absolutely incredible legacy, and a story that we wanted to tell. And it's just one of the many stories that Brock comes across in his research into the wider history and story of soccer history in Utah. And I think what fascinates me the most about the research that you do, Brock, is that stories like this keep cropping up that we don't know about, but are just absolutely incredible to talk about and to listen to.
Yeah, definitely. That's one of the things I love most about research, and getting caught in a rabbit hole is you're looking at something else and then you find this other side quest, this other side story. And then that opens up a whole, can of worms and things to research and look into and stories to find. And so I love it. I love diving into Utah soccer history, and I'm very passionate about it, as I hope you can tell. And I hope to be on the pod again with something else I found. So we'll see.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that. So anything else that you want to add just before we finish up for today?
I just want to say thanks again for having me on. I'm grateful for your friendship and all the time we've chatted over the years. Hope to be on again someday and share something else. And I just want people to know that, soccer is alive and well here in the States and in Utah. It's thriving. There was a study done that said soccer is the most played sport by youth in Utah, in the country, that no other state has as much participation than Utah in soccer. Everybody grows up playing, and sadly, through the years, they move on to something else. But it's a start, and I want to share that there is soccer history here in Utah and share that with people. So I'm grateful for you having me on.
Anytime. Likewise, very appreciative of your friendship and the conversations that we have. I think one of the things that I've enjoyed doing most over the last few years, especially when we have a podcast that's centered around soccer in America, sometimes a lot of people might shy away from listening. They might not be interested because it's soccer in America or CONCACAF. But what we are always trying to remind people is that soccer history has existed in America sometimes since before a lot of our European clubs. One of my favourite things that you told me actually was that the Danes Cup has been a thing since before Bayern Munich were a thing, and since before all these other trophies across the world. And I think a lot of people are quite quick to say that there is no history of soccer in America, or MLS doesn't have a soccer history or whatever. And it always gets confused and mixed up with the sentiment that there is no soccer history at all in the US. It's complete bullshit. Like it's just not true, because there are so many interesting stories even happening now in soccer in America that we can touch on. Always happy to have you back on to discuss them, Brock. Once again, thank you to all of our listeners for tuning in for this episode. If there are any questions that you want to ask about this recording, or if you want to suggest an episode yourself, you can DM us on any of our social media, or you can also email us at hello@footballheritage.co.uk as well. We'll see you all again next week. Goodbye.